Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be discussing my Women's Health presentation by Cindy Ferrante. So, the topic of my presentation is impacts of COVID-19 on women. I picked this topic because I thought it was super interesting. COVID-19 the whole pandemic was super interesting to me on how it affected people my age especially, because a lot came out of it regarding, obviously I know this isn't related, but regarding eating disorders and mental health. So I felt like this topic was super interesting and I was really excited to learn more about what women really felt during it. And I also spoke to my mom as well and asked her about it, and I showed her this presentation and I wanted her to relate to it and see how she felt during it and what changed for her and if she could relate to any of the things I included in this presentation. So first, for part one, we're going to be discussing the demographics of my health issue, which affects women. And I mentioned my health issue on the previous slide, COVID-19 on women. So, COVID-19 expanded all over the world, and it severely hurted businesses, it hurted communities, healthcare systems, and due to increased exposure rates and caregiving responsibilities, women were disproportionately affected, especially those in frontline or care roles, but overall, everyone was affected by this pandemic. The virus affected women's mental health. It created difficulties in reproduction. It affected maternal health and so many more aspects. Furthermore, women in lower socioeconomic categories have experienced worse outcomes due to increased health disparities. So I did some research on long COVID and the long-term symptoms of COVID-19, which is also known as long COVID. And some of these long-term symptoms include chronic fatigue, they can include cognitive impairment, respiratory problems. These things have been more common in women compared to men. And the pandemic caused considerable employment losses. Obviously, so many places closed. Everyone was out of a job at this time period. It was unbelievable. And this caused caring responsibilities more to women. Most women were home and they as well as their kids were home. I mentioned that in the later slides, but these mothers and these women, their children were home and they had to take on the role of going from a job to being home all the time, 24/7. And there's so many disruptions to life. This is just a change out of nowhere that came and just took us all and changed us completely. And women who experienced severe cases of COVID, those who were pregnant or had pre-existing conditions, they had problems on impact their general health and impacted their mental health, their well-being, and everything along the lines of that. To continue demographics, women are affected due to their roles in providing care. And specifically, we could discuss the healthcare and the service industry. And the differences in healthcare access based on gender. Now, in the United States, we're very lucky. Most people have healthcare access. If we go further, we can discuss classes of lower class and higher class that has more or less healthcare access. I did mention that. But socially, women are more likely to lose their jobs or have to take time off during lockdowns. And this, like I said, they took care of their children. Regarding the financial aspect, women experienced more substantial losses, particularly those who held lower paying positions. Health-wise, risks of domestic abuse, reproductive health issues, and already existing gender gaps in healthcare access grew worse. I mentioned domestic abuse just briefly here, but a lot of the times, women and their spouse or the person they were living with, this was them two in a house. Domestic abuse cases increased so much during the pandemic, and this impacted pregnancy and childbirth. And as the pandemic progressed, women provided care were specifically impacted by the virus and all of its societal effects. So, regarding demographics of Japan and United States, were the two countries I decided to compare to each other. And For the most part, I saw a lot of similarities. I mean, obviously, they're different countries, like, there's going to be differences, but for the most part, there was a lot of similarities that I found because we were both going through the same thing. So, in the United States, women were significantly impacted by COVID 19, especially in terms of higher rates of emotional stress, increased caring obligations, and decreased employment, all that I mentioned. The virus was more commonly encountered by women, particularly those of lower class and minority backgrounds. And typically, these people worked in like vital industries, they worked in retail, healthcare. Women who worked in healthcare were in these hospitals helping people. I mean, like, they didn't get a break, but typically, women are more likely to be in healthcare. There's typically more women, you know, not necessarily, I don't have statistics, but more nurses and stuff like that. So these women are going out there and putting their lives on risk. In Japan, the COVID 19 virus had a similar effect on women. The effects were exacerbated by the cultural norms that were surrounding caregiving. Japanese women experienced an immense amount of stress since they had to deal with employment issues and they took care of their children and they went to school. And, like, once again, the children in Japan as well did not go to school, same as the children in the United States. So these moms were home with their children 24/7 all the time, and they were both dealing with this together, like new things for both people to experience. Um, to continue to talk about demographics in Japan and the United States, women's varied ethnic makeup in the United States. In the United States, we have women of all ethnic backgrounds that live here, and this has resulted in the differences in health outcomes. With I the article that I put was about Black and Hispanic Americans, and I learned a lot about this and about how it was for them during COVID and how they experienced work and how opportunities arose and everything along those lines. But age differences were a major factor in the United States. Older women were, of course, I mean, we know older individuals were so much more susceptible to the catastrophic COVID 19 outcomes. However, ethnic homogeneity is more prevalent in Japan. So the United States is geographically diverse, and this caused women in metropolitan areas to become more exposed because of population density. I mean, we do, of course, like, have major cities, so many people live in the United States, and there's just so many ways to get COVID. I mean, that's for everyone, of course, but women in rural areas, they had more difficulty getting access to healthcare. So one side was women were overexposed, and then one side was women had trouble access getting healthcare. And women in Japan were more exposed due to country's dense population in cities like Tokyo, while some hazards were reduced by the country's effective healthcare system. Japan, it seemed that they do have an effective healthcare system, especially at this time of the pandemic, and especially with everything going on. It seems like they're pretty beneficial with their healthcare. To continue, demographics of Japan and the United States. Women's health was impacted by the United States' uneven public health responses throughout the country. So despite having more coordinated public health response, Japan had a delayed vaccination distribution, which put women in caregiving and other jobs at risk. Now, I remember when there was mention of the vaccine and that there was going to be a COVID 19 vaccination, I remember people were getting it immediately after that was out there and they were tested on it and made sure it was safe. People were getting it. And in Japan, it seems like from a little bit what I learned, the vaccines in Japan were more of slower announced. They needed to do more testing. Like, they weren't like, so get the vaccine. Like, it was, I mean, obviously they came out with it, but just a little more delayed. And in the United States, women living in low-income areas were more vulnerable to environmental hazards. There's so much increased pollution in the United States, crowded housing, raise a risk of contracting COVID-19. Urban density posed comparable hazards in Japan. However, some of the negative effects on environmental health were lessened by the country's lower pollution level. So, Japan has lower pollution levels than the United States. So, environmental hazards, like, it was less in Japan than it is in the United States. Women in the United States with higher levels of education had greater access to information about COVID-19 prevention and treatment. Women in Japan had difficulty obtaining access to healthcare services, and public health initiatives took place which allowed women to receive access to reliable information about the pandemic. So, I mean, obviously, of course, people in the United States and people in Japan were both finding out information, but some people would find out more information. People who were in the healthcare industry learned more things. I mean, there's so many factors into it, but a lot of the times, people in different places knew different things about the pandemic and what was going on, truly. So, part 3, we're going to discuss cultural similarities and differences among women. So, women, of course, I've mentioned this so many times, but it is the truth, and this was really what caught my eye. Was like I mentioned it at the end, was like the motherly instinct of a woman and the motherly job of a woman. So women are traditionally expected to take care of the home, and they take care of children in both their children in both the United States and Japan, of course. And during the pandemic, this was made even more apparent. Caregiving responsibilities were the primary reason for women to cut back on work hours or quit their careers completely, since most children were not attending schools. I mean, my mom is a teacher and she was teaching, and she made her office a school and was teaching her children on Zoom in the office while I was in my room learning virtually. So it was completely crazy and different. And a lot of the times, younger children, I mean, they didn't go to kindergarten, first grade, these important prime years of school where they learned so much. They were learning on Zoom. I mean, it was crazy. And so women frequently put the health of their families before their own, I mean, which had an impact on access to healthcare. In the United States, expectations to combine work and home commitments added strain to women during lockdowns. Whereas in Japan, cultural norms regarding women as caregivers may have contributed to this imbalance. Women's experiences throughout the pandemic were greatly impacted by racial injustices and economic inequality. Women from underrepresented racial groups experienced disproportionate employment losses and had restricted access to healthcare in both nations. One of the biggest sources of stress, particularly for single moms, was financial uncertainty. Of course, for every single person during this time, everyone was experiencing financial uncertainty. I mean, most people were not working, they were not making money. I mean, the bills that you're paying are staying the same, but you're not having income. Of course, this is so hard on single moms because they had to deal with this, they had to come up with the money, not having that job that they usually support them and their children on. Mental health problems that women face have also increased due to social demands to maintain appearances. Of course, women, what do they want to appear as? Women are strong and they want to appear as that always. You don't want to show weakness. And during the pandemic, it was so hard. Women were showing weakness. And the pandemic's impacts were exacerbated by limited access to healthcare, especially for women of color and those of lower incomes. To continue about cultural similarities and differences, racial and economic stereotypes influenced how women were perceived, especially during this time. The likelihood of women of color working in lower paying frontline positions raised their risk of contracting COVID-19. Yes, absolutely, women of color were working, but so was everyone, but that's specific for the racial and economic stereotype. Such women were frequently forced to continue working in hazardous conditions due to the unstable economies that the world was in. Their health outcomes and access to healthcare during the pandemic were impacted by traditional ideas about women's roles in caregiving, which placed an increased pressure on them to tend to ill family members. I mentioned again, but if their children are sick, most likely those women and those moms are going to get sick as well. Women's vulnerabilities were made worse by male-dominated power systems in both countries during the pandemic. Men frequently held the majority of positions in decision-making when it came to public health, healthcare, and work-related policies, which frequently ignored the special requirements of women. As a result, women were more vulnerable to the detrimental impacts of COVID-19, including more caregiving duties, employment losses, and restricted access to healthcare. Due to bias in the healthcare system, women's complaints and concerns were occasionally dismissed, which had a negative impact on their health. Of course, women were expressing their opinions, men were expressing their opinions, but women, I found that they were truly unheard sometimes with their feelings because a lot of people didn't understand what they were going through and how they felt at this time. So, part 4, we're going to discuss ethical considerations and action. Women in Japan and the United States experience a difficult time dealing with both remote work and family obligations. In order to combine work and family, many have adapted by daycare and homeschooling, in addition to their careers. So, these mothers their job was to take care of these children. They were hosting a daycare and a homeschool at the same time because there was no daycares open, there was no schools open. I mean, this was all a woman's job. This was all a woman was doing at this time. Nonetheless, women during this time were frequently bearing an excessive amount of the domestic work. In order to help women who were losing their jobs and had to take on caregiving duties, the American government offered stimulus packages that included money for daycare and unemployment assistance. Japan introduced cash assistance for emergencies as well as economic help for working parents. However, both nations came under fire for not doing enough to meet women's long-term needs, especially when it came to protection from domestic abuse and maternal health care. Women were experiencing extreme mental health issues and, there was services, and I'm going to mention that, but sometimes it never feels like enough, especially when you're going through something so hard and everyone's experiencing the same thing, but all different in different ways. In both nations, women's health associations played a crucial role in offering assistance throughout the pandemic. Local organizations in the United States have made mental health services more accessible, particularly for women who are victims of domestic abuse, stress, and anxiety. So this is something amazing that they did and they provided for women. Similar groups have supported those experiencing job loss or caring duties in Japan and offered resources for women's mental health. COVID-19's disproportionate effects on women globally and have called for gender-sensitive methods to economic recovery and healthcare. They have demanded equal access to vaccinations and medical supplies, as well as expanded availability of maternity health services and protection for women against domestic abuse. Traditional gender norms were strengthened during the pandemic in both the United States and Japan, because many women were expected to take on more domestic duties, including caring for others and running the home. It was widely recognized in the United States that there was an unequal distribution of unpaid work at home, while cultural expectations regarding women's caregiving obligations were particularly strong in Japan. The distribution of vaccines brought up serious ethical concerns, particularly with regard to equitable access. Both countries struggled to guarantee that women receive vaccinations, particularly those in high-risk or vulnerable populations, such as pregnant women or healthcare workers. An ethical concern was prioritizing these groups while balancing the limited resources that were available. Of course, when the vaccines came out, there wasn't many vaccines. There wasn't. And they gave them to the teachers and the health, the jobs that were out there working first. During the pandemic, structural obstacles, including economic disparity, restricted access to healthcare, and a lack of government backing hindered efforts to promote women's health. In Japan, societal norms and rigid job structures made it difficult for women to prioritize their health. Systematic healthcare inequities in the United States pose substantial barriers to equitable health promotion, particularly for women of color. In conclusion, in summary, the COVID-19 pandemic revealed and intensified pre-existing gender inequities, which have a disproportionate impact on women in both Japan and the United States. In addition to bearing a disproportionate share of the caring load, women have had higher unemployment rates, more mental health issues, and unequal access to healthcare and support. Despite personal initiatives, women have faced substantial organizational and societal barriers. Even though local and government organizations have supported women by providing financial help and mental health services, among these things, these initiatives have frequently failed to meet the long-term demands of women's health and well-being. Systematic improvements that support gender equity in healthcare and beyond, flexible workplace rules, and ongoing activism were crucial for overcoming these obstacles. Women experience COVID-19 in different ways, based on factors such as age, children, careers, marital status, and more. This presentation mainly focuses on the mother role of women during the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed listening to my presentation.